In my previous rebuttal, I examined Stephen Woodford's debunking of Dr. Peter Kreeft's informal summary of St. Thomas Aquinas' argument from motion for the existence of God. In this video, Woodford does a deeper dive into Catholic philosopher Ed Feser's more developed version of the argument from motion. And for that, Woodford should be commended. Frankly, many atheists aren't even aware of the strongest versions of this argument. Now, let's jump into his video, and I'll share with you some of my thoughts.
When asked to justify the existence of his God, Ben predominantly relies on two arguments, that being the argument from sufficient reason.
One is based on the principle of sufficient reason, this idea that we have the capacity to understand the universe.
And the other, and most prominent, is Thomas Aquinas' rendition of Aristotle's unmoved mover. And it's this argument that I'm going to respond to within this video, as given away by the thumbnail.
So I'm going to make now an Aristotelian/Aquinas argument for the existence of God. So the basic idea, and I'm going to try and boil this down so that it makes some sense. The basic Aristotelian argument for the existence of an unmoved mover is the idea that there are a bunch of, every object around you has actual and potential, right? It has an actuality and it has a potential. So if you have a candle and it's made of wax, it has the potential to be a pool of wax, but that potential is not fulfilled unless something acts upon it. The only thing that can act upon an object and make it fulfill its potential is either another object that has its own potential or something that is pure actuality, right? Does not have any potential. It's just actual. It just exists, right? So the idea in the Aristotelian argument for God is that if you don't want an infinite regress of causes, if you don't want an infinite regress of things that have actuality and potential, and then something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, you have to come to the unactualized actualizer, right? A thing that just is, right? A thing that just exists, and as Aquinas says, this is what we call God, right? This thing that exists and has the capacity to actualize the potential of other objects. And so this is his argument for the existence of God, that otherwise you get an infinite regress, and there need not be an infinite regress of causes.
This is a fairly decent summary of the argument, which is hard to do because Aquinas' use of terms like potency and act are very foreign to modern audiences, and they need a little unpacking. But on the whole, this is a fine summary.
So there's Ben's explanation of the argument. But before giving any objections, I want to bolster it via Edward Feser, who is a philosopher that Ben both endorses and often defers to.
If you want to read a good book about proofs of God, then Edward Feser is a book I've recommended on the show.
Basically, the Aristotelian argument starts from the fact that change occurs, right? So, you know, the water in the cup here started out being really cold when it came from the fridge, and now it's kind of lukewarm, right? That would be an example of change. Or I move my hand through space and so forth. That's an example of change. Aristotle argues that on analysis, change always involves the actualization of a potential, something going from potential to actual. My hand's potentially over there, now it's actually over there. Water's potentially lukewarm, then it becomes actually lukewarm. Whenever something goes from potential to actual, there's always something already actual that makes that happen. And if that already actual thing goes from potential to actual, there's something already actual making that happen. So we've got one thing being changed by another being changed by another, or one thing being actualized by another being actualized by another, and so forth. And Aristotle concludes that we would have a vicious regress if there weren't something at the bottom level, you might say, that actualizes everything else without having to be actualized, because it's already, as he puts it, purely actual. It's moving other things or changing other things without itself being moved or changed. It's what I call in the book, a purely actual actualizer, or an unchanging changer, or an unmoving mover.
All I'll say is Feser is the man when it comes to this argument. And so this is a very good summary of it, especially in an informal interview.
Now, Feser's rendition of this argument is composed of 49 premises. Yeah, I'm serious, 49. But Aquinas' was much more in line with most arguments, being 4.
I'm not sure what Woodford's argument is, but it seems to be that most philosophical arguments are really simple and only composed of a few premises. But what's weird with this criticism is that in his other video on the argument from motion, he gripes about it not proving more about the unmoved mover's attributes.
Even if we accept every premise of Kreeft's presentation of this argument, all this would prove is that an unmoved mover existed, and that's it. Seriously, that's all it would prove. It would not prove that this unmoved mover still exists, that it's a being, that it's conscious.
But premises 19 through 49 of Feser's argument show why the unmoved mover has divine attributes like omnipotence or omniscience. But then Woodford complains that there are too many premises. So do you want it to have few premises but not prove what you want? Or have enough premises even if you think it's too many?
Now, truth be told, I'm torn between whose rendition to primarily address, as Ben more often references Aquinas than he does Feser, but the latter evidently takes every opportunity he can to accuse atheists of not understanding the arguments that he upholds.
And then you encounter skeptical writers like Nietzsche or David Hume or Bertrand Russell or someone like that. You're very impressed by that because you hadn't heard it before. You didn't realize there were people who were presenting these objections. So you're very impressed by it. You're usually a teenager anyway, so you're open to hearing the language of rebellion. A lot of the objections that were trotted out, I realized, were aimed at caricatures. They were aimed at straw men. They weren't really attacking what Aquinas or Leibniz or whoever had actually said.
Right. Many people who attack Aquinas' arguments, and even people who defend Aquinas, don't understand the true nature of his arguments. And we should always refute the strongest version of our opponent's argument.
On this note, the esteemed biologist Jerry Coyne wrote an excellent rebuttal to Feser, and correctly predicted his reply by writing, "His response will consist in noting my failure to have spent half my lifetime studying the works of Aquinas and Feser." Indeed, this is the same trick that many Muslims employ when they insist that unless you've read the whole of the Quran in Arabic, you can't possibly dismiss its divinity. You know, Einstein put it best, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. As did John Adams when he said, "Mystery, and in this case a billion premises, is a convenient excuse for absurdity."
Woodford has confused simplicity with brevity. A 2-hour-long Disney animated film can be fairly simple, whereas a New Yorker cartoon can be tough to figure out, even though it's just one drawing. The fact that Feser's argument has 49 premises does not mean it's incomprehensible word salad, whose length is only meant to deter criticism. When you sit down and read the argument, you see it's fairly straightforward, and it doesn't require knowing advanced topics like modal or symbolic logic. Also, Woodford would criticize a Christian for arrogantly dismissing an entire field he obviously doesn't understand. But imagine he said, "Well, I don't have time to read every textbook on biology before I show why evolution is false." Woodford would rightfully condemn his intellectual laziness. And the same can be said for people who want to refute the arguments of Aquinas and refuse to read even basic defenses of his arguments or explanations of his philosophy.
Anyhow, I'm going to focus primarily on Aquinas' rendition, but I'll simultaneously touch upon Feser's. So here's Aquinas' rendition, as translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province. Premise 1. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion.
If you have a candle and it's made of wax, it has the potential to be a pool of wax.
Basically, the Aristotelian argument starts from the fact that change occurs.
This premise I of course accept. Things change.
So far, so good?
Premise 2. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act, for motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it.
The only thing that can act upon an object and make it fulfill its potential is either another object that has its own potential, or something that is pure actuality. If you have a candle and it's made of wax, it has the potential to be a pool of wax, but that potential is not fulfilled unless something acts upon it.
On analysis, change always involves the actualization of a potential, something going from potential to actual. Whenever something goes from potential to actual, there's always something already actual that makes that happen. The water in the cup here started out being really cold when it came from the fridge, and now it's kind of lukewarm.
Now I'm happy to tentatively accept this premise. Feser had the potential to make a 4-premise argument 49, and then he actually made a 4-premise argument 49. But the reason I say tentatively is because, sure, everything we've observed appears to adhere to the principle of causation. That is, everything that's actual appears to have been actualized by a prior actualizer. But since we've only observed a tiny fragment of the universe, and since we're yet to discover the theory of everything, that is, a coherent theoretical framework that fully explains and links all aspects of the universe, we can't honestly assert that everything adheres to the principle of causation, lest we want to commit a black swan fallacy.
Woodford doesn't understand that Aquinas is not making an inductive argument. His argument about self-actualization being impossible isn't based on us never observing this happening. It's not an observation like all swans are white. People thought this statement was universally true until it was refuted a few centuries ago when black swans were found in Australia. What Aquinas has done is he's shown that this prohibition on self-actualization is required by the nature of reality itself. Woodford's argument would be like saying, you can't say it's impossible to go back in time and kill your own grandfather when he was a child, because we've never observed time travel to see if this can really be done. You don't have to know everything by empirical investigation. Sometimes principles of reasoning show us how reality is. And the principle that objects can't actualize their own potential is just as well founded, because Aquinas shows how affirming self-actualization would lead to irresolvable contradictions.
And so yes, I accept this premise, but only under the rubric of ignorance. But here's the thing, and here's what's funny. The proponents of Aquinas' unmoved mover don't accept this premise, even tentatively. While they insist that
whenever something goes from potential to actual, there's always something already actual that makes that happen.
They make a special exception, or commit a special pleading fallacy, for their God. They insist that their God had the potential to create the universe, that it then actually created the universe, but that it did so without something actualizing it. Either this, or they insist that their God doesn't have any potential to be actualized.
It does not have any potential. It's just actual. It just exists.
But in which case, it follows, according to their logic, that it cannot actualize anything, because
on analysis, change always involves the actualization of a potential.
Woodford's objection seems to be that God cannot be a purely actual actualizer because he has the potential to create the universe. If God actualized his own potential to create the universe, then why couldn't the universe actualize its own potential to come into existence? One way to respond to this objection is to make a distinction between change in a thing and change in relation to a thing. Change in a thing is easy to understand. I used to be less than 5 feet tall as a child, and now I am more than 5 feet tall as an adult. I underwent change in my own being. Potential became actual. But consider this statement. I am now shorter than my son. Now, because of compression in the discs in our spine, we do shrink a little over time. But what this statement means is that there is a change, but not in my own being. My son got taller, which changed my relationship with him, or changed me into being shorter than him, even though I didn't undergo change or potential to actual. The philosopher Peter Gage calls this a Cambridge change, and Aquinas references something similar in the Summa Theologia. All right, now back to the universe. In the act of the universe coming into existence, the potential for the universe to be created does not exist in God. It exists in the universe. Acquiring the property of being creator of the universe represents a Cambridge change in God. Saying God made the universe is like saying, I am now shorter than my son. My son's increase in height explains the change we perceive in me, even though nothing has actually changed. In the same way, the universe's coming into existence explains the change we perceive in God, now that we call him he's the creator of the universe, but nothing actually changed in God. And this also becomes clear when we think about what it would mean for God to have the potential to create something, right? What does that mean? When you and I have the potential to create, we have an idea that exists in time as a potential thing before we bring the idea into actual existence. Or we have potential energy stored up in our bodies that becomes kinetic energy when we bring our ideas to life. But God is timeless, spaceless, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Everything is immediately present to God in a perfect eternal now, So there is nothing God must do in order for his will to be done, or there's nothing that exists as a potency waiting to become an actuality in God creating the universe. Sure, when we create as finite temporal beings, we have to exercise our potentials. But God, once again, he's timeless, he's infinite, he's changeless. God, everything is present immediately and perfectly with God. So when God creates, the only potential that is actualized is the potential in the things that are created.
Anyhow, moving on, premise 3. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e. that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and then by another again. Now, there's a fair amount of confusion around this premise, and it's generally agreed that it's not needed for the argument, which is presumably why proponents, including Ben and Feser, don't include it. Given this, I'll keep my thoughts brief. Some see Aquinas as simply describing the law of non-contradiction, which states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true. But others see him as asserting that an object cannot change itself. But then the question becomes, what exactly is an object? If, for example, a steel rod that's heated on one end counts as an object, then objects can actualize or change themselves, because if the rod was left alone, the hot end would warm up the cold end. Hence, this is a false premise. But again, Ben and Feser don't employ it, so I'll move on.
This premise is important for showing that things cannot change themselves. They must be actualized by something else. Woodford thinks that this can be refuted with a counterexample, something like a steel bar that is heated on one end, but then heats itself on the other end. But this proves Aquinas' point. The change doesn't happen to every part of the bar simultaneously, but one part of the bar, its potential to be hot, is actualized by an outside source of heat. And then the other part of the bar, with the potential to be hot, is just actualized by the hot part of the bar. The fact that this occurs with a composite object made up of smaller proper parts, that doesn't refute Aquinas' primary argument against self-actualization, or showing that anything, any potential that is actualized, must be actualized by something else.
Premise 4. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover and, consequently, no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand.
If you don't want an infinite regress of causes, if you don't want an infinite regress of things that have actuality and potential, and then something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, you have to come to the unactualized actualizer.
We would have a vicious regress if there weren't something at the bottom level, you might say.
Yes, if we don't want an infinite regress, it seems, given what we know, that we must assume an unactualized actualizer, or a first cause, or an unmoved mover, or a non-contingent contingency. But that's definitely not sufficient reason to conclude that there is one. In fact, that's simply an argument by assertion. And in Ben's case, it's also an appeal to emotion.
If you don't want an infinite regress of causes, you have to come to the unactualized actualizer.
To quote Ben,
"Facts don't care about your feelings."
And I don't care about what we want, I care about what's true.
Woodford is being a bit rigid here. Feser and Shapiro are operating under the assumption that infinite regresses can't cause anything, or they are impossible in the actual world, and you don't want what's actually impossible. Therefore, if your argument requires an impossibility, then your argument's fatally flawed. It would be like saying, if you don't want a fallacy in your argument, then you need to make sure the conclusion follows from the premises. To which it would be silly to say, I care about what's true, not what I merely want in an argument. But both have the same goal, that what we want is the truth in a sound argument.
Now, unlike Ben and Feser, Aquinas does provide an argument, that being that if the deterministic chain were to go on forever, there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover, but this simply doesn't stand to reason, and this is primarily because it's based on outdated and flawed Aristotelian physics. If there is no first mover, which is to say, if cause and effect is infinite, we have an answer that accurately accounts for our observations, and, most critically, one that doesn't require us to make an unfounded assumption that violates everything we know.
Here, Woodford is contradicting himself. On the one hand, he's saying we should stick to known explanations, not unknown ones like an unmoved mover that we've never observed. But the alternative to an unknown, unmoved mover is an equally unobserved explanation, an infinite chain of causes or movers. This has never been observed in the actual world, and yet Woodford seems perfectly content to let it be a candidate explanation. So, if that's the case, then an unmoved mover should also be allowed, since it's never been directly observed either. We haven't observed infinite causes or unmoved movers, but an unmoved mover is a superior explanation to infinite causes because it actually explains the motion. As the Catholic philosopher Garrigou-Lagrange once put it, it makes more sense to say a painter moved a paintbrush than to assume the brush doesn't need a painter because it has an infinitely long handle. This is simply based on timeless logic and metaphysics, and it has nothing to do with Aristotle's principles of physics.
Or to put this all another way, given all the evidence we have for movers absolutely requiring a mover, do we have sufficient reason to believe that there's a mover that doesn't require a mover? No.
The use of the term mover is obscuring the point that needs to be understood. Given all the evidence that potentials cannot actualize themselves, nor can they be the product of an infinite chain of actualizers, we do have sufficient reason to believe in a purely actual cause. If it is a purely actual cause, then it isn't a mover. It's not in motion or moving at all. It's not changing. Instead, it's causing all change. An unmoved mover isn't something that moves itself or moves without help from other things. An unmoved mover is just something that causes motion in everything without receiving motion from anything or undergoing any motion of its own.
As weird as it might seem, as unintuitive as it might seem, the evidence indicates that everything is contingent on something, and this is further bolstered by the fact that the law of conservation of energy has never been violated, even by quantum mechanics. Instead of thinking of a ladder-like chain of events, think of a long circular chain of events, one in which every cog is turned by another cog, and hence there being no need for a cog that turns itself.
The problem with this example is that it uses circular causation, which is not capable of explaining anything. It's like asking, why are 3 Eskimos in New York City? You could say number 3 followed number 2 followed number 1, and number 1 followed number 3. But that doesn't explain why any of them are there in the first place. If you have a bunch of gears that can't move themselves, then adding an infinite number of them together in a chain, or forming them in a circle, doesn't create any motion. Instead, you need a gear that, once again, provides motion, but doesn't receive it from anything else, which would correspond to God. Although, as we saw, this central gear actually moves, while God undergoes no change whatsoever. He's just pure actuality that causes change in everything else.
Now, just in case you're thinking, what about the Big Bang? Doesn't that prove an absolute beginning? The answer is definitely no. I won't explain why here, as it would take too long, but I'll leave a link below to a video in which I do.
And since the argument from motion doesn't require the universe to have a beginning, I'll save my thoughts on this subject for one of Woodford's future videos or a future rebuttal on my part.
And finally, here's Aquinas' conclusion. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and everyone understands this to be God.
You have to come to the unactualized actualizer, right? A thing that just is, right? A thing that just exists. And as Aquinas says, this is what we call God.
Do you know how New Agers label inanimate, unconscious, mysterious things God? Well, it seems that Aquinas beat them to it. Now, to his credit, Aquinas didn't propose that this argument proves the existence of his very specific Christian God. For that, he offered additional flawed arguments. But my point being here is that even if this argument was valid and sound, even if it proved the existence of an unmoved mover or an unactualized actualizer, that's literally all it would prove. It wouldn't prove that there's only one unactualized actualizer.
It would, because in order for there to be 2 separate actualizers, one would have to possess something that the other lacked to distinguish them. which would represent a potential. But if there was potential, that would mean neither of them was the purely actual actualizer. In addition, each actualizer, if there were two of them, would have to share a more fundamental kind of framework that they both occupied. This would be another source of potential for them, and it would show that neither of them was the ultimate foundation of reality. So the argument for motion certainly shows there's only one purely actual actualizer.
That it still exists, or that it's conscious.
If the cause has no potentials, then that means it has no potential for non-existence. Also, if it doesn't change, then it can't go out of existence, because change is a temporal process. Finally, the argument from motion shows the cause of the universe must currently exist, because this cause explains the current motion that we're observing right now. As I said in my previous video, one way to show this cause must be conscious is because it is immaterial but causally effective. The only immaterial things that exist are minds or abstract objects like numbers. But abstract objects like numbers are causally impotent. They can't make things happen in the world. That leaves us only with an immaterial mind being the reasonable conclusion about the nature of the ultimate cause of the universe, what is the purely actual actualizer.
And it definitely wouldn't prove that it inspired a 600-year-old man to build a boat in order to survive a worldwide flood, etc. Now, to be fair, Ben evidently offers additional arguments as to why he attributes such qualities to this unactualized actualizer, and Feser spends premises 19 to 49 doing the same. But these are really additional arguments, and so I'm going to tackle them in a subsequent video.
Once again, notice that Woodford basically says, this argument sucks because, at most, it only proves an unactualized actualizer exists. Feser and Shapiro say that the argument proves this unactualized actualizer has divine attributes. But Woodford's response is, well, I'm going to confidently assert that it doesn't, and I'll promise to prove that in a separate video. I'll be waiting.
To recap, the objections I've brought up in this video are as follows. Premise 2 commits a black swan fallacy, since it's based on incomplete knowledge. Premise 3 either states the law of non-contradiction or it's simply a false premise. Premise 4 is an argument by assertion, and in Ben's case it's also an appeal to emotion fallacy. And the conclusion is a special pleading of the second premise. What's more, even if the argument was sound, all it would prove is an unactualized actualizer, and that's literally it.
So I think we've seen that I answered all of these points that Woodford is bringing up in his summary. If he responds to this video, I'd like to let him and others know that I don't do rebuttals to rebuttals of my rebuttals. After all, we wouldn't want an infinite regress, would we? Instead, he and I could settle this in something like a debate or other public engagement. In any case, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a really blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.